Thanks for taking the time to download this BBC Radio 5 Live podcast. To search for other podcasts you might like, click bbc.co.uk/5live, where you'll also find our terms of use.
Hamilton drives towards the line and goes fastest, a second clear of Max Verstappen in second place. A round of applause for him in the Mercedes garage, because he has just become the all-time pole position record holder in Formula One.
Pole position, mate. You found got yourself another record.
When it comes to qualifying in Formula One, there's no one better than Lewis Hamilton. In 2017, we've seen records tumble as first he swept aside Senna and then surpassed Schumacher as the driver with the most pole positions in the history of the sport. It's a remarkable achievement, but how does he do it? Over the next hour, we'll take you inside the Mercedes team to find out what makes Hamilton the master over one lap. And these are the voices we'll hear from.
James Vowles, Chief Strategist.
Andrew Chauvelin, Trackside Engineering Director.
Hi, my name is Toto Wolff. I am the team principal of the Mercedes Formula One team.
My name is Niki Lauda, and I am to Lewis what I am, the mentor. No, I'm his mate.
And we speak to the fastest man in the history of Formula One.
I guess it's when you and your car come together and your art is really displayed. I don't think many people talk about it as being art, but it is a fine art. It's the fastest you get to drive at any point throughout the weekend, and it all comes down to that one moment, and I love it.
This is a 5 Live Formula One special. P1, Lewis, Mercedes, and the art of qualifying. I'm Jennie Gow, and with me over the next hour is the BBC's F1 reporter Tom Clarkson. And Tom, qualifying, it's not just a case of getting in the car and hammering it.
Well, on one level it is, Jenny. As Lewis says, it's the fastest lap you're going to do on a weekend. But for someone like Lewis, you're building up to it because there are 3 segments to the session. The first 2, known as Q1 and Q2, are knockout sessions where you lose the slowest 5 cars. And then for Q3, you're left with the top 10. It's 12 minutes of banzai laps. And that is when you see Lewis Hamilton do his thing. And my goodness, he does it well.
Alongside Tom is the chief F1 writer for the BBC Sport website, Andrew Benson. And Andrew, drivers often talk about being on the limit in qualifying. But what does that really mean?
Well, it's the limit of adhesion, Jenny. It's as fast as the car can possibly go around a corner. Braking as late as they possibly can without going off the track, going around the corner as fast as they can without going off the track again. It's a balancing act. It's completely unrelated in many ways to what you're doing when you drive to the shops. It's a combination of balance and feel and coordination and bravery.
That's exactly how I drive to the shops. I don't know what you mean. Now, Tom, over the course of a race weekend, how important is qualifying? I mean, when does preparation begin for it?
Well, it sort of begins back at the factory before you even arrive at the racetrack, but specifically over the weekend. It starts really in the second practice session on a Friday afternoon. They do what they call a qualifying simulation. They don't take all of the fuel out. They don't run high qualifying engine modes, but that's when they start to get a feel for qualifying. But it's slightly track specific. If you're at somewhere like Monaco where it's really difficult to overtake, qualifying takes on even greater importance than it does at somewhere like Spa-Francorchamps, where it is easier to overtake. But qualifying, I mean, look at Lewis Hamilton has converted 39 pole positions into victories. So that in itself tells you how important it is, and that you need to start at the front, because if you get held up in traffic, then you can lose the race. Simple as that.
Well, over the next hour, we'll take you inside the Mercedes team, from the driver to the pit wall to the garage, to explain what it takes to make the perfect pole-winning lap. And we discover what makes Hamilton so good. And make no bones about it, he's not just good, he's very good. And that's not just anyone's opinion. That's the opinion of his former McLaren teammate, Jenson Button.
The thing with Lewis, we raced together for 3 years in the same team. And in the races, we could have some great battles, and, he'd win a race, I'd win a race, and it was really close between us. But when it came to qualifying, it wasn't. He was just immense when it came to qualifying. He could really pull it out when you thought that you had him beat. He's definitely still got that feel for the car over one lap. Yeah, for me, over one lap, he's also... I don't think there's anyone as quick as him. I really don't. And I don't think there ever has been.
Jenson, you outscored him in races over your 3 years together, but what was he doing over one lap that you weren't?
I think with the car he could, even if the balance wasn't quite there, he was strong. He would drive the car from the rear. He didn't mind oversteer on entry, apex, exit. He was a little bit more ragged than my style, but it worked. He could go through qualifying and have 3 or 4 terrible laps and be nowhere. You'd be half a second up the road. And then you get to Q3, and even if his first run wasn't good, the second run would just come out and it'd be 2 tenths in front, and you'd be like, I don't know where that came from. I thought I did the perfect lap. But yeah, he was a tough teammate in that regard. But we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, and qualifying was definitely his strength.
I find it fascinating that the now retired Jenson Button can so freely admit that he was beaten fair and square by the likes of Lewis Hamilton. But it does go to show that if someone like Jenson can say it, then there is something seriously special about Lewis Hamilton in qualifying.
I think what Jenson was just saying there proves how psychological qualifying is, and that I'm sure Lewis, one of the reasons he was letting Jenson be half a second up the road in Q1 and Q2 was because it didn't matter. And I think Jenson would sort of get that full sense of superiority, and then it would really hurt him when Lewis would come in. And that sort of adaptability, flexibility that Lewis has, particularly for the feel for the rear end of the car. Now, in qualifying, you're trying to just maximise just speed everywhere through corners, particularly slow corners, because that is where you're spending obviously more time than a quick corner. And you want the rear end to move around a bit, almost like on a pendulum, to just speed up the cornering process through slow corners. And Lewis loves driving with the rear end of the car. So I think if there's one thing, Jenson said, my style was smoother than Lewis's. And I think the fact that Lewis could drive with a loose rear end on the car and swing the car, a bit like rally style almost, through the slow corners, I think is one of the reasons he was so much more dominant in qualifying, particularly in an imperfect car. But just to understand what Hamilton is doing in the car, Niki Lauda now takes us behind the steering wheel as Hamilton approaches that final run in qualifying.
You get the right tires on the car, qualifying laps, they are shiny and brand new. Then you drive out of the pits, don't exceed the speed limit. Then you have a plan. How many corners I have to drive, how quick to get these tires to the peak point as soon as it goes into the last corner before start and finish. There it all starts. So he has to bring up the temperatures. If the temperatures are too high from the beginning, when he ends up start the lap, he will lose out. So he needs to understand exactly how slowly he has to bring the grip level on the optimum when he goes in the last corner before start and finish. This is the number one thing. Then he has to go flat out. So flat out means he has to brake at the absolute best point without stopping a wheel, without coming off the line, absolute perfect braking. And then he gets into the rhythm of what he can do. So when he does the first corner well, then the next corner comes easier, still going on the limit, over the curves, from one to the other, and then he's in a normal rhythm to finish this lap. So if his tires don't go weak in the end of the lap, which can happen if he pushes too hard, then he has pole position.
How easy is it to execute what you've just described?
For him easy, for the others not.
So it's natural talent?
Natural talent, but the others know it well. Too depends on temperature condition, tire condition, whatever. But the driver who understands it better, what to do, will be in the end the quickest.
So, as Niki says there, Andrew, it's not just about the driver. There's a lot of different factors going into making the perfect qualifying lap.
That's right. I mean, Tom was talking earlier about the preparation starting even before they get to the racetrack. The car arrives at the racetrack in a certain condition, then the driver and the engineer work together with the rest of the team to get it as perfect as they possibly can for qualifying. That involves some compromise because you've got to think about the balance between the qualifying and the race. You want different things from the car for that. So it's kind of where's the perfect middle point for there. Then when you're going into qualifying, the tyres are changing, the track conditions are changing. That affects how the car behaves on the track, how the tyres behave with the car. and you've got to be careful with the tyres. They're very sensitive. How do you bring them up to the right temperature, as Nicky Lauda was talking about there? People find that very complex. Some people get that right, some people don't. And then there's all the different engine modes that these complex hybrid engines have, and Mercedes have a special qualifying engine mode that helps them and Hamilton in the end of Q3, the last part of qualifying. And then once all that's been tuned to perfection, then it's up to the driver.
Right. There's a lot to think about then. Hamilton's feel for the car. Jenson Button and Nicky Lauda have spoken about it. But what does that actually mean? Well, here's former F1 driver and 5 Live analyst Allan McNish.
When you're on a qualifying lap, you feel the sensitivity of the grip when you're braking. And that's the first moment when you've got any understanding of what the car is going to be like, how the rear is stable, whether you've got that deceleration that you expect, whether then when you release the brake very, very slightly and you start to turn the steering wheel to run in towards the apex, how quickly the front responds. But is the rear of the car still staying with you, or is the rear starting to oversteer? And then when you need to increase the steering lock and you're releasing the brake pressure up towards the tightest point of the corner at the apex of the inner curb, how the front feels. Does it still have that lateral grip? Are you still being pushed into the side of the seat and holding on, and the steering weight in your arms is building up because the grip of the front tyre? And then as you start to progress and push back onto the throttle pedal, how the car squats down, how it then transfers the load from that front left tyre, if you're turning into a right-hand corner, onto the left rear, and whether the rear still has a grip as you're then going back onto the throttle and then coming out of the corner. It's all of these senses, the load on the body, what your eyes and your body are feeling, and then the steering loads into your hands is the information and feedback systems that the driver uses. And all of that gives you the understanding of your car and what your car is giving you. But the car's got to give you it in a very consistent manner, in a manner that you can understand, you and the car talking exactly the same language.
So, Tom, when it comes to trying to compare Formula One to other sports, qualifying to that pinnacle of, achievement in other sports, how do you do it?
Well, I think, as Allan was alluding to there, you're getting so much information as a driver that the guys who can slow it all down are invariably the really good ones. And I think that applies to bull sports in particular, isn't it? If you think of, I like to think of it as timing. Why does Roger Federer do that beautiful down-the-line backhand? Why does Joe Root time that off-drive so beautifully? It's because I think they just have more time. They can read the ball as it's leaving the bowler's hand. They can see what it's going to do. And I think Hamilton, his senses are so attuned to that Mercedes car that all those things Allan was just talking about, he can feel it before it's almost happened. So he's preempting it, he's reacting to it. And I think one of the telltale signs just to see how good Hamilton is in terms of how he's reading the racetrack around him is, Andrew and I, well, we all go, Jenny, to winter testing where there are no markers. Like at a Grand Prix, you'll get a 150-metre board, a 100-metre board.
So when you're going down towards one of the turns, yes.
One of the turns at a Grand Prix, you get a warning as to how far the turn is away. During testing, there are none of those boards. And the number of drivers you see locking up just completely at sea without these markers, I think is significant. Hamilton never does. He just knows he can translate everything he's feeling without any of these exterior markers. And I think that's one of his great assets.
He says, doesn't he, in his book, and when you speak to him very openly about the amount of time he spent with his father just on braking points, and his dad would stand at the point that he was going to brake out on the track and then gradually get closer and closer to the apex and to the point where was the absolute limit.
Late braking is one of the absolute keys to his speed. He talks about being the last of the late brakers, and it's easy to say that, but to be able to do that and still be able to have that feel for the car as it's slowing down into the corner and braking and turning into the corner. Obviously, the car's sliding all the time, which people might not be able to see on television, but that's what's going on. That incredible feel that he has, that's what marks him out, particularly that braking phase.
Well, we will talk to the man himself, Lewis Hamilton, after 9:30. Fascinating interview that Tom did with him. But let's talk about his car, because we've already established from Allan McNish and the others that we've spoken to, that's a major part of what goes into a qualifying weekend. So let's go inside the Mercedes garage now with Chief Strategist James Vowles. Now, he's the man who nervously sits at the end of the pit wall during qualifying in the race and has to make decisions about the likes of tyres, engine power modes, track position, so that they can get their drivers onto the race racetrack at the perfect moment with the aim of securing pole position.
Once you enter qualifying, you'll notice quite a change in atmosphere, in my experience, in the team. It doesn't matter whether it's Q1 or Q3, it's quite a serious and orchestrated, I would say is the right word, so the mechanics have a very good understanding of what they're doing and how to do it. The drivers are the same. It doesn't really matter whether it's Q1 or Q3. They approach it in a very similar manner, because should they make a mistake in Q1, there's opportunity to correct it again and the position may not be there, but if they have to run again, the implication on the remainder of qualifying is fairly serious. But they do build into it in the sense of the amount of risk versus reward they take builds as you go throughout qualifying. And there's different moments to it. So as you go into qualifying 1, you're trying to get a feel for how the track's changed, and it does change. And what the driver's trying to do, and what we're trying to do, is understand how much of a change that's been, how to adjust to it. And remember, we can't change the car now. As soon as you leave, you're in parc fermé. But we can still modify the front wing, and the driver can modify his driving style. What that leads to is effectively how do you then build into this crescendo while still extracting the performance you need to make steps at every point. There's quite a bit of planning that goes into qualifying, and the timings aren't a coincidence. We choose timings that should allow us to have the best positioning on track. At some tracks it's very important that the driver has no one in front of him in order to do the outlap as he wishes. At other tracks it's important to actually have a car in front of you such that you can tow. So again, the positioning and the timing is calculated really to within about 3 or 4 seconds in order to try and maximise those opportunities.
Is Lewis heavily involved in the strategic side of qualifying?
Heavily, no. He is involved. I think that's the best way of putting it. So you need to make sure that the driver has entirely bought in to the psychology behind what you're doing in qualifying. There's absolutely no point in just presenting him a set of tyres and saying, go out there, bud, and off you go. That doesn't work. What you need him to be doing is telling you and providing you feedback. If you say, right, we have a soft tyre at this point in time, you need to work with him and say, what do you need in order to get a feel for a baseline for the car? Do you need a couple of laps, 1 lap, push lap? Do you need to get a feeling, how's the braking changes when we change engine modes? Is it a significant enough change that actually you want a little bit of practice before we get to qualifying 3? Work with the driver to extract the maximum you can from him, because a lot of it is about having the driver in the right mental state. The car performance is one aspect of things, but you're asking drivers now when they get to qualifying to find the absolute limit of their performance and of the car's performance. And in order to do that, in my experience, you need to have the driver in the right mindset and bought into what the team is doing as a programme.
Hamilton's on pole position for the British Grand Prix. A storming lap. He is half a second quicker than anybody else around the Silverstone circuit. Absolutely unbelievable lap from Lewis Hamilton. He will start on pole position, one of the laps of his life.
In all the drivers that I've ever worked with, Lewis is the one that is able to very, very quickly and dynamically react to a set of differing circumstances. Be it that the track temp's warm or the wind's changed, that the conditions on track are slightly different. Where he's very good at becoming unfazed is that in those given situations he returns back to a baseline of confidence and then builds from there. And that's one of the key reasons as to why he is so good in qualifying. It's that ability to dynamically react to circumstance and change. What Lewis is able to do is deliver performance almost on cue when he needs to. And he finds a limit or a new threshold of performance that other drivers just simply aren't able to achieve. Lewis this year has made another step as a driver, which is quite an interesting thing to say. His approach to the weekends is a lot more scientific than I have seen from him before. He applies more science, more work, more practice. He's working much closer than I've seen him before with the team, because he knows that everything matters this year in terms of the championship. It's no one element of things. It's not that he watches more videos or looks at more data or spends more time talking to the engineers. It's everything that he's just improved by 1% that allows him to extract a lot more from the car. That's part of the difference for me.
Lewis Hamilton does all he can in the final race of the season in Abu Dhabi, but it's Rosberg across the line in second place. It's Rosberg who is world champion of 2016.
What he's done is take a reflection on what happened last year and improve on the small aspects of things that he believes contributed perhaps to him not extracting everything in 2016. And what I'm seeing now is a man that has changed those things, fixed those things and adapted. And it's an impressive sight to see. And this is what I love about the sport. You're not working with normal individuals. You're working with the absolute top tier of people in the world. In the case of Lewis, I strongly believe one of the best, if not the best in the world.
Is Lewis the fastest qualifier on the grid today?
I'm going to say yes to that. And it's odd for an engineer to commit definitely to that, but I'll explain why. I think Fernando is exceptional as well, but there are times where he isn't extracting everything that car has to bring from him. And against Sebastian, there are times where Sebastian had a faster car, and Lewis has managed to beat him by milliseconds, but has managed to beat him. And that's why I would say in 2017, and the statistics will reflect this, we haven't had the fastest car necessarily at all of those events, and yet he has delivered every single time.
So that's James Vowles, the chief strategist at Mercedes, a man who works very closely with both Lewis Hamilton and his teammate Valtteri Bottas. And that's the point, isn't it, guys? For people who say Hamilton only ever gets pole position or gets his race wins because he's in the best car, Mercedes hasn't always been the best car this season.
Certainly not this year, but I think it's fascinating to hear James saying how Lewis has changed this year. And I actually think the lack of Rosberg in that team is a huge factor. I think Lewis, for the last 3 years, has been so obsessed with Rosberg that has prevented him from being open with the team because he doesn't want to share too much data in case it got into the hands of Rosberg. Whereas now, without that challenge in the adjacent car, he's much more open with the engineers. He doesn't mind Bottas getting some of his information. And as a result, he's just a better driver than he's been at any point in his Formula One career. I certainly noticed in Japan the way he led the team vocally, and just you watched him arrive in the pit garage and it was saying hello to all of the engineers, talking to all engineers, even talking to Bottas's engineer. It's a much more cohesive environment at Mercedes now, and that is helping Hamilton's overall performance.
Rosberg not being there is a contributing factor, definitely, but I wonder whether the lessons of 2016, where he did have some reliability problems, yes, but also he did underperform himself in certain areas. He got himself in a bit of a tiz at a couple of races in qualifying. You think back to Japan with those controversial press conferences that he had. And he's been a lot more stable and balanced this year. And I think James Vowles is absolutely right. He's learned. And I think he would have been a very difficult challenge for Rosberg this year, just as he was in 2015, if you remember, whether Rosberg had been there or not.
Do you think the fact that Ferrari and sometimes Red Bull are now in the mix and really pushing Mercedes and the team has actually helped Hamilton focus and get the best out of himself?
Quite possibly. I think this is the other thing that's interesting about the statistics this year. 10 poles out of 16 races so far, but you look at where he's been and where Bottas had been in relation to the Ferrari, particularly in the last few races. Bottas has been nowhere. Hamilton's been still sticking it on pole at most races. By and large, the Ferrari is a much more consistent, user-friendly, easier race car. It might not have the ultimate Q3 engine mode, but it has underlined that Hamilton is the fastest driver.
I think Lewis has been helped too by the fact he's now leaving his footprint on Formula One by breaking records, because I think he is motivated by that. And I think every pole he gets now, he knows he's extending the record. And that just, the desire, there's no sign of it waning in Lewis Hamilton. When you've had all his success, you've got all his money, yet he wants it now as much as when he first came into Formula One in 2007.
Well, let's bring in Andrew Shovlin. He works with the engineers running the cars and implementing James Vowles' strategy, making sure they're on the right tyres at the right time. He's worked with the likes of Jenson Button, Michael Schumacher and Nico Rosberg. So how does Hamilton compare?
I think it's just his desire to win is so absolutely enormous that it completely colours how he works and how he competes. And it's interesting because a lot of people would assume that Lewis is just naturally quick. He jumps in the car and he bashes out a great lap, which you think you could do that if you had an amazing car and an average teammate. But, Lewis has had some very, very strong teammates, and that's the bit where you've got to do all that preparation and that work. And I think it's that side of him that people don't really realise. But what he does bring to it is just this incredible feel for the car and the balance and knowing where the limit is. It's the way that he can just keep finding time and finding more time and feeling when the tyres are coming in. And all the drivers can do that, but it's how well they do it is a differentiator. And I think with Lewis, it's, over the recent years, he's just got better and better by learning how to combine that sort of enormous natural talent with the sort of understanding of the technical side of the tyres and the power unit and the chassis and bringing it all together.
Do you see likenesses between Schumacher and Hamilton that you think, that surprised me or it was interesting?
They've both got an ability to drive around problems and change their style. And it's interesting because they don't really have any characteristic style. They just do whatever's quickest. And that's an incredibly useful tool to have. I think the feel for conditions as well is something that Lewis is incredibly good at. You see him in a wet qualifying where every lap they do, there's a different grip level. And for two characters who are at, absolute opposite ends of the spectrum, there are actually remarkable similarities when you can sort of look at how they achieve success and the different ways they go about it.
So, similarities between Schumacher and Hamilton. Tom, what do you reckon?
I think they're two completely different drivers. I remember Jock Clear, who was Schumacher's engineer, saying that, he was asked so many questions by Schumacher, whereas I think Lewis is more of a guy who just goes out there and delivers. And I think you don't need to understand the car in the way that Schumacher did to be able to get the most out of it. It's all about your feedback and giving the engineers what they need to set the car up as you want it.
Do you think, Hamilton always gives the impression of the man that, just as you say, goes out there, floors the car and gets the best out of it, but he does carry around a notebook, he does take notes. Is he kind of like the man who says, oh yeah, I haven't done any revision, but actually sits down with the books and goes over them thoroughly?
Well, I don't think he would say that. I don't think he thinks that he gives that impression, but I think that is an impression that people have of him, and I think it's wrong. He is a cerebral driver, even if people don't think that he is. That's the side of him that's underestimated.
This is 5 Live Sport.
5 Live Formula One.
It comes down fundamentally to just raw talent that one or two drivers every generation have, and he has it. He's one of the quickest, if not the quickest, driver in Formula One, certainly of this era. I don't think there's anything complicated about it. It can be spoiled if people don't do all the other stuff. If they don't know how to make the tyres work, if they don't know how to set the car up, they don't work well with the team. That talent can get wasted, but he's not wasting it. He has that raw speed. He doesn't mess up any of the other ingredients to make sure he can use his raw talent. You all see it. They get a new teammate, they come up against that raw talent, they want to find a reason why it's there, and ultimately they have to understand that the guy's special.
Welcome back to 5 Live Formula One as we discuss the art of qualifying with Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. I'm Jennie Gow, and with me are the BBC's Tom Clarkson and Andrew Benson. Now, the voice you just heard was that of Ross Brawn, Hamilton's former boss at Mercedes. 71 career poles to date for Hamilton, and that record looks set to continue as we head towards the remaining 4 races of the 2017 Formula One season. So time to hear from the man himself. Tom sat down with Lewis Hamilton just after he'd stepped out of the car after qualifying in Japan, a session where he once again took a stunning pole position.
Qualifying has always been something I've enjoyed and generally excelled at, but it's all about the small percentages and getting those extra little bits out of your qualifying performance. Your own personal performance has been my real goal this year, and I've managed to do that. That's crazy. It's hard to believe that I have 71 poles now. I really am just a small chink in the chain, a large chain of so many people who make it possible. But I'm grateful of my chink, that part of the chink that I play, because it's an integral part.
Can we elaborate in any way on just how you've managed to improve yourself this year? Something you said to me earlier was about your composure, just so calm and cool in that car throughout the session from Q1 through to Q3.
I don't know. I think, look, I'm 32. I've been doing it a long time. I think it's really about being meticulous with the balance you have in life. And everyone has to have their own balance. You've got to achieve it your own way, find it your own way, not from people telling you how it needs to be done. So I think, you've seen how I've lived my life over the years, and I really think that the balance that I allow myself to make is what enables me to perform the way I do. And then obviously I arrive at the weekends in a positive frame of mind. I don't have any baggage. I generally don't give a what about what anyone says. I know my values, I know who I am, I know what I'm about, and I know what I'm here to do. And so I do it. So it's just, I guess it's about building a force field of being able to ricochet all the negativity that tries to penetrate. Nothing generally gets in. And I know how to race, I know how to drive. It's about doing it. I've got a great group of engineers. we've made a big step in how we communicate. Communication is everything, so how we work together is at its finest this year. Same with my mechanics, and I wouldn't change it for the world.
If you look at the stats, it seems as if you're more consistent in qualifying this year. Is that because of the relationship with the engineers? How much of it's down to the car, and how much is it down to you?
I would say it's more to do with communication with my engineers. Ultimately, I've got these really intelligent individuals, and it's about trying to make sure you get 100% out of each one of them. And they need to understand what they need to give you. If you don't give them the information of what you need, they can't guess. And so that communication is everything. So I think really this year, building on our routine, and so they know exactly what it is I need. They know exactly what they need to do in order to provide me with the best platform to deliver what I deliver. And then for me to arrive into qualifying with the frame of mind that I have in that calmer state, I think collectively that's why we have the poles we have.
Can we take it back a step now and just say, what is it about qualifying that you love? Because you've said, I think, on numerous occasions that it's the part of the weekend that you almost enjoy the most. And just, why is that?
I think it's because it's shorter, it's intense, it's infused with so much energy. The pressure is at the utmost in that you go out, you do your 1 out lap, and you've got that 1 lap to perfect and to deliver. And I love that challenge. And I think it's different in the race. It's a completely different, it's like a game of chess. But in qualifying, it's the ultimate performance, putting all the pieces to the puzzle together. That's when you attack. That's when you really go into battle. Car's light. It's the fastest you get to drive at any point throughout the weekend. And it all comes down to that one moment and decisions you make, and I love it.
Is it like it's the only part of the weekend when you get to express yourself as a driver?
I guess it's when you and your car come together and your art is really displayed. I don't think many people talk about it as being art, but it is a fine art. How you use the track, how you use the signs, how you use all the different things for information, and how you utilize the tool that you have underneath you. So many of us can drive one single lap fast, but it's about ticking all the boxes. It's about having the balance through long runs. It's about having the balance of how you use the tires. It's fuel. It's decisions you make when you're around other cars. It's how much you attack, how much you pull back. And it's, when you play computer games, if you play football and you've got different teams with different strengths, that's really about, as a driver, trying to make sure that you are in the upper percentile in each of the strength areas. And that's what I try and work on every year. And it's never perfect, which is great because you always have something to work on.
Lewis, are you a guy who likes to visualise the lap before you do it? Or are you a reactionary? Do you just react to what's happening when you're out on track?
Yeah, I've never visualised a lap before. I tried it. For me personally, a complete waste of time and did nothing for me. You can't predict what you're about to do. You can't put in your mind that you're going to turn at this point, because it's the greatest thing about racing these cars is that it's all on the dime. It's all in the split second. It's about how you react. It's about the snap oversteer that comes. You can't predict that that's going to happen. So it's really just about being on your toes, ready. And I love that because you're just thrown so many different balls are coming from different directions, and you just got to catch them and throw it back. I love that. But again, everyone has their own way of preparing themselves. I saw one driver, I think it's probably Sebastian, used to close his eyes. I don't believe he does it now, so I don't know if it was just a bit of a show because he always had his visor open so people could see. And there's all sorts of different mental coaches. What I can definitely advise is any kid that's out there trying to race, don't listen to people that tell you need a mental coach or you need someone to help control your mind. You need to let it run wild and free and discover yourself. It's all about discovery, and only you can do it. No one can tell you don't do that because I've done it before. You have to experience it in order to learn and grow from it.
Discover yourself and you'll be a better racing driver.
Yep, and a person.
You're listening to a 5 Live Formula One special on the art of qualifying. That was Lewis Hamilton, of course, speaking to the BBC's F1 reporter Tom Clarkson. And Tom, how did he look at you when he was talking about that? Because to me, I listen to that and I hear him totally enthused and alive and passionate.
Well, because, as he said, this is the bit of the weekend that he loves more than any other. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's a sort of unwritten rule among the drivers that the pecking order among them, I think, is established on a Saturday afternoon. There are so many variables in the race about looking after tyres, fuel consumption, whereas for one lap in Q3, those factors don't count. It is all about nailing the perfect lap. And the guy that does that more than anyone else is Lewis Hamilton. And therefore, I think that positions him among his peers as the main man. And I think Lewis gets off on that. I think he loves that.
And when it comes to his mental state, I feel, Andrew, that that's a huge contributing factor when we've seen him not perform well to when we see him absolutely on the limit.
I think you're right. He is up and down. He can be. He has been at times in his career. And we've even seen it this year. There have been times in the first part of the year where the car wasn't doing what they wanted it to do, and he was out-qualified by Bottas. But I think what's happened in the second half of the season, and he's not actually addressed it yet, and it's actually something I intend to ask him about in Austin next weekend, is what happened over the summer break? What has turned him around? And it has to be something mental, because the car isn't really any different. But he has come back from that summer break on another level. He used that phrase, another level himself. But what we haven't yet heard him say is why and how.
He calls it an art. Now, when we sat down to talk about this programme, we were like, is this the science of qualifying or the art of qualifying? And Lewis called it an art, so we went with art.
Well, it's kind of both, isn't it? But it is an art in the sense that, I mean, it's what they're doing is kind of like a combination between tightrope walking, dancing, and sledging down a really steep hill. You know, everything's so on the edge. And when you watch, it would be wonderful if we could see their hands and their feet, because they're balancing the steering with the brakes and the throttle all the time as they're going into and through a corner. And I think it's obviously science is involved in the physics of how the car goes around the corner, but watching them do that, you know, the dexterity involved, it is a form of performance art as well.
I agree with you. I think on track, it's art. Off track and everything that's going on in the garage, that's science.
Hamilton said there in that interview that he doesn't visualise the lap, and I was really surprised by that. But then when I thought about it, I was like, oh, well, yeah, I would expect that from Hamilton, because he almost gives the impression he doesn't care until the moment he gets into the car, the moment he sits in a driver debriefing, the moment he gets, in front of what actually matters, not just us lot on a Thursday.
He couldn't resist having a dig at Sebastian Vettel either, could he? How much of that was all about having a dig at him? But, I think Hamilton is we've already discussed it earlier in the show, actually, he is a cerebral driver. And one of the things McLaren will tell you is that an area where he was particularly strong when he was at McLaren was translating what he was seeing on videos onto the racetrack. Earlier on in his Formula One career, he would watch a lot of videos of other drivers to see what they were doing in terms of line in particular. And he would translate what he was seeing on a video to the racetrack very, very well, apparently.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about his mental preparations, because one man who knows very well is his mentor at Mercedes, former world champion Niki Lauda.
Some guys, they can really bring it right to the point when it's important. Normal being, they operate in a normal way. They say good morning, good evening, they have breakfast, lunch and dinner, and they live their normal life. Sometimes more exciting or less exciting. But when you're a racing driver and you have to deliver, then it's a different ballgame. So Lewis can certainly deliver. That means he sits in his car and says, there's one lap now, I have to get pole position. And he switches something on, which very few people have. And this one-off, from nothing to everything, he is able to do in no time. And therefore he can squeeze out the last couple of tenths out of a lap, where you have easy to do that when you push hard, then you make a little mistake, then you go too far, you brake too late, you do all these kind of mistakes. But on his laps, he does no mistake and drives the car right to the limit in every meter of the circuit. That makes him different.
Is he the best qualifier of the current era?
Yes. Lewis is able, and therefore he's so strong. Out of a bad Mercedes, he can squeeze it out. So in Kuala Lumpur, for example, the car was not able to be on pole position. But Lewis could do it. So he can overdrive problems on our car and delivers. And this is the outstanding performance he can bring. And therefore, qualifying, he's the master.
But why is he the master? Is it a greater amount of feel? Is it a greater commitment?
Both. Commitment, he can drive a car quick, he knows what it's all about. He pushes himself, he knows how to set the car up, he knows the tires, he needs to know the temperature of the tires. He has the full picture of what it takes to drive the car in that speed.
Fascinating hearing Niki Lauda, who is obviously, a former world champion who can speak very clearly about what Lewis Hamilton is thinking and feeling, and saying it's like a switch that Hamilton can just turn on. And Tom, has that always been the case, or do you think that's something that has developed quite recently?
I think Niki Lauda enjoys watching Lewis Hamilton because I think Hamilton is a much better qualifier than Niki ever was back in the day. But Lewis has always been very good over one lap. I think he's learned to optimize the tools around him. So in terms of what he's been able to deliver, the art form that we've talked about, he's always been able to do that. But maybe he hasn't been able to optimize the car around him as much as possible. Typical, when he came into Formula One in 2007, it took him half a season to get a pole position. Okay, he was up against a man called Fernando Alonso in the other car, but still it took him a while to learn how to do it.
Andrew's already spoken a little bit about what happens during the car and almost the balletic movements of it with hands, feet, thinking, the mental agility as well. Here's BBC analyst and former F1 driver Allan McNish talking about what happens when he's in the car and what Hamilton does that others don't.
When Lewis Hamilton sort of builds up a lap, I think it's just the way and the precision of hitting every single breaking point, every single apex. That's a very difficult thing to achieve because every single qualifying lap is a complete adventure. Every corner on that qualifying lap is a bit of an adventure as well. So you go into the corner not 100% knowing what is going to happen. And you've got to have that feel for where the grip is in the car and not making mistakes is one of the points that I think he's been able to deliver in the last couple of seasons, where he's just consistently been absolutely there and pulled qualifying laps out where we just think, wow, where did that come from?
So Hamilton isn't taking, a new maverick racing line. He's not doing anything necessarily that the others aren't doing. He's just managing to deliver better.
Well, in some ways he is doing what the others aren't doing, in the sense that he's braking a little bit later than them. He's carrying a little bit more speed through the corner. I'll give you an example. Italy in 2014, I think it was, he was on pole by 2 or 3 tenths from Nico Rosberg, but there's one particular corner on the lap, at Lesmo 1, he was 15 kilometres an hour quicker than Rosberg in the same car through that one corner. So there are things he's doing that other drivers can't do. That's what being faster is all about.
And the way that he's working with the team this year, we've already heard from the team themselves, from Lewis Hamilton, the communication that he's bringing, that he's delivering to them and that he's asking for them to deliver back to him is significantly different from, let's say, where he was 5 years ago.
Well, he's much more open this year. I mean, something we touched on earlier is that without Rosberg, that internal intra-team battle, he feels he can be more open. Toto Wolff said after the Malaysian Grand Prix, where Hamilton finished second, having started on pole position, it was the most productive debrief after the race that they'd ever had, because Bottas and Hamilton were sat there in the same room discussing their problems and sharing their problems, which is something he hasn't been able to do because the rivalry with Rosberg has been so intense before.
Well, let's hear a little bit more from the man himself, Toto Wolff. Yes, that's the man that sounds like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I can assure you he is the boss of Mercedes Motorsport.
Lewis is gifted with a great talent that he has developed throughout his careers, from go-karting all the way into Formula One. He's a hard worker, very diligent in his approach, on a very steep development curve. He's somebody that never settles. He's never happy in where he is as a human being and as a racing driver. He wants to optimize, he wants to develop, and we are seeing that very much in the team. He's become part of the leadership in the team. When times are difficult, he's calm and motivating with the other members of the team. but he's also capable of being very objective and neutral about his performances and the team's performances, and that's made him become a strong pillar of the team.
Now, what about your involvement with his qualifying performances? What do you say to him prior to the session? Does he need any cajoling by you? Are you a mentor in some way?
My opinion is that with a driver that has so many years of experience, it doesn't need any motivation prior to qualifying a race. All this fist bumping is complete nonsense. It makes the driver lose concentration. You should leave him alone, do his own preparation, focus and concentration.
Is Lewis the fastest driver you've ever worked with?
Yes.
So let me ask you the question then. Let's say Hamilton wasn't with Mercedes. He's not in one of the best cars on the grid. He's not with the team that he feels so comfortable and clearly can communicate with at the moment. Could he still get all these pole positions?
No, he wouldn't have the records, of course not. But he would still be absolutely outstanding, and he would still be beating his teammates, and he would still be the absolute benchmark for the other drivers. You know, they know who's good and who's not, regardless of how quick their car is, which is why, you know, for example, Hamilton's arch rival Fernando Alonso is still held in such high esteem, even though he's not in a quick car anymore. Hamilton can do the job no matter what the car is. He'll still be outstanding.
At McLaren, with Ron Dennis there, the man who signed him when he was, 8, 9, 10 years old, that man compared to the man he is with Mercedes is totally different. He isn't restricted now where he was by McLaren. McLaren owned him, and that was a difference to him, wasn't it?
Well, Lewis Hamilton owes his career to Ron Dennis. Even now, you have to say that. Without Ron Dennis picking him up at 10 years old, he wouldn't be here. But it's something he talked about, wasn't it? You've got to be your own man. You don't need a mental coach. You've got to experience all these things yourself. And I think maybe that's why I think a lot of people struggle to understand Hamilton, and that they can't compute the man that's on the catwalks in LA, with all his music chums, and the guy that's going out there taking the cerebral approach and delivering on a Grand Prix weekend. And I think that is why I think he's a bit Marmite, I think, in people's judgment of him.
Yeah, what Mercedes have done is they've given him the space, they've allowed him the space to grow into who he is. And McLaren was, not so much now, but when Ron Dennis was in charge, is a very, very controlling environment, and they ended up falling out as a result of that. And part of the going to Mercedes was about stepping outside of that control. He didn't know at that time that Mercedes were going to be as dominant as they are. In fact, McLaren were a more competitive car at the time when he made that decision, and lots of people criticised him for it, and how stupid do they look now. But love him or hate him, and obviously he does divide opinion, he's become the man he is with the freedom that Toto Wolff has given him. And Toto will tell you, you can't try and force him into a box that he doesn't want to be in. He performs at his best when he is allowed to live his life the way he wants to live it. But I think there's no question that he's performed better as a human being and as a driver, growing up into fully formed adulthood, as he's done later than some people have because of the controlling environment at McLaren, through that space that Mercedes have given him.
And the freedom that Toto Wolff gives him, I think, is there's a brilliant example of it this coming weekend. Lewis is, goodness knows what he's doing this weekend, but Valtteri Bottas is being made to go to the DTM, the German touring car championship finale at Hockenheim. And I did say to Valtteri, all right, Lewis not going. And he just looked at me and raised an eyebrow, as if to say he doesn't get made to do that kind of stuff because he needs that freedom. But it does bring out the best in him.
So we've spoken about Lewis's exceptional ability to qualify. He is now the best ever in Formula One. But what about converting that to racing, Andrew?
Well, I mean, what makes him outstanding as a complete package is that if you were to ask me, is he a better qualifier or a racer, I'd actually struggle to answer the question. He is an absolutely outstanding qualifier. Of course, the statistics speak for themselves. But he's equally good as a racing driver. I don't think there's anyone better than him, fighting his way through a field, overtaking, all that kind of thing. I think you could argue, perhaps, maybe Fernando Alonso is as good as a race driver as him, but I don't think there's anyone better. So he's outstanding on every level.
Well, what can Hamilton achieve in the future? It's a big question. So, team principal Toto Wolff is the man to answer it.
As long as we give him the right car, he has already broken the qualifying record. and that shows how good he is on a lap. But I think he can break all records that exist in terms of race wins and championships.
With Mercedes?
Hopefully with Mercedes. I personally deem him as being the best current Formula One driver. He is making a car that is sometimes a little bit of a diva, still look very good. Insofar, Mercedes has been very much part of Lewis's career since the beginning in Formula One, and we hope that it's going to last for many more years.
Now, we all get criticism for being on the Hamilton bandwagon. I'm sure this programme has done nothing to alleviate that. But if you look at the record books, Vettel, Prost, 4 times world champions, Fangio, 5 times, Schumacher, 7 times. He is getting himself into that crowd of people.
It's not about nationality. You'd have to be blind not to see how good Lewis Hamilton is. He is one of the greatest Formula One drivers there has ever been. We can all argue all day long about who is the best in our opinion, but he is absolutely right up there with the very best there have ever been, and that is an end of it.
And Tom, when you look at the future for Lewis Hamilton, I'm intrigued to see, do you see it at Mercedes until the end of his career, or will a Ferrari switch be inevitable?
Well, I think he'd love to go to Ferrari, but Vettel staying there now until 2020 might have scuppered that for him. I think every Formula One driver throughout history has thought about going to Ferrari. There's a magic there that is difficult to put into words. Everyone would like to win a championship with Ferrari, but Mercedes want to keep him at Mercedes. They're going to have to pay, but I think he might stay there.
Well, just to add to that, in the interview that Tom did with Lauda, the part of it that we haven't heard in the show, Nicky said that they want Hamilton to stay and Hamilton wants to stay, and Hamilton has already talked in news conferences this season about he doesn't see any reason why he won't stay with Mercedes. I think he'll do at least another 2-year contract at the end of 2018, which is when his contract runs out, so I could see him staying at Mercedes for the foreseeable future. OK, very quickly, will he break Schumacher's record of 7 world titles? That's a big ask. Lewis is 32 now. What's he got, 5 more years? Yes, he could do it, but it would depend on him staying at Mercedes or being in a car that is at least as dominant as it has been for the last few years.
Well, guys, we've heard from some amazing people with some incredible insight into qualifying, the art of it, and Lewis Hamilton. What do you think we learned from that?
I think we've learned that they verified what we all thought, what the statistics have proven, that he is the most successful qualifier in the history of Formula One. And I think speaking to the team, speaking to Jenson Button, they have just emphasised the point, really, that yes, he is that man, and we've learned a little bit about how he's done it as well.
I think what they've also emphasised is that he's a much more rounded racing driver and athlete than people give him credit for. It's not just about a raw, naked talent, which he obviously has in abundance. It's about hard work, it's about intelligence, it's about commitment. It's about bringing that whole package together into one peak in that 1 hour on a Saturday afternoon at which he excels.
Well, this has been The Art of Qualifying with Lewis Hamilton and the Mercedes team. And if you'd like to find out more, Andrew Benson has written a fascinating article going in depth into this, which you can find on the BBC Sport website. And if you've missed any of tonight or just want to listen to it again, then this will be turned into a podcast as soon as possible, and it'll be on the 5 Live website. We are back next week with the US Grand Prix, where Lewis Hamilton could clinch his 4th world title if he wins the race and Sebastian Vettel fails to finish in the top 5. And of course, it all begins with qualifying on the Saturday.
On digital and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
bbc.co.uk/5live.